Finally made it. Catalina Island, California, one of my favorite places in the whole world. I have so many great memories here, coming here with friends and camping and bringing my family here. Catalina is an island about 20 miles off the coast of Southern California. And it's maybe 20 miles long itself, 8 miles wide, but it has a charm all of its own. It's part of what are called the Channel Islands, and is formerly called Santa Catalina. The island's main industry is tourism, with about 3,500 inhabitants. Catalina is a virtual world unto itself. It has a timeless beauty that's unique. The main town is named Avalon, where we are right now. Avalon has a European coastal charm, with restaurants, hotels, beaches, and in front of it all, Avalon Bay, where the boaters moor their vessels before coming ashore. There's much more that Catalina offers: wilderness, camping, ocean activities, historical museums and homes, and it's so easy to lose track of time here. You and I can also live an island-like existence, cut off, surrounded by sea, but God did not design life this way. We were meant to be connected and in relationship, really as the landmark of a meaningful life. In fact, the Bible tells us we're to be one or united as Christ and the Father are one. But when things go wrong in relationships, we have to take action. We have to say no to harmful things. We have to set protective boundaries to guard our hearts and to guard our lives. But for how long? Forever? God never designed us to live like an island forever, protected and guarded and safe. We're supposed to get out there and risk relationships again. Well, that's what this whole series is about. Something to discover. And I hope you find it helpful. So come on, the island's waiting. Welcome to the Beyond Boundaries video series. It's my hope that this series will help you in lots of ways. Your relationship with yourself, with other people, and even with God. The core message in the material in this series has to do with what we do with relationship, especially if there's been difficulty, and how to come back out of difficult relationships into better relationships. You see, none of us are exempt from tough relationships. You might have had a tough marriage. You might be in a tough marriage. You might have a difficult dating relationship. There may be a friendship or a family relationship that's hard. There may be something at work that's going on. Or you may be still dealing with something from your family of origin, mom, dad, siblings. But just the nature of the human condition is that we have difficult relationships. Well, what we want to work with is the fact that even though there have been hard times, that we can move beyond isolation and withdrawal, even when there's been a lot of damage, and move back into intimacy and vulnerability the way that God intended. Now, in this first session, we're going to talk about a sequence of 4 different events that present the problem and the situation that all the rest of our material is going to deal with. And as we're going through these 4 events, these sequential events, I want you to think about and identify which one of these you're on, because most of us can identify with being at least one of these. Here's the first one. We were designed for relationship. God designed you and me for relationship. A life outside of relationship is not a life that God designed. In fact, there are 2 kinds of relational lives. One's what some people call the vertical or the spiritual, the one with God, and the other's the horizontal. And that's the best place that anybody can be. In Psalm 42, verse 1, it refers to our relationship with God. David says, "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, O God." There is a draw, there is a desire, there is a craving for relationship that we were meant to have. God put that desire into us so that we could connect to Him in deep and life-giving ways. But the second one, the horizontal one, is there in Scripture too. That's the one where we need each other. In Ecclesiastes 4, Solomon says, "Two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up, but pity the man." And in some translations it says, "Woe to the one who falls and has no one to help him up." You see, the Bible never teaches that isolation is good, and the Bible never teaches that isolation from each other is good. We need God and we need each other. In fact, the psychological research about well-being and health shows that people who are connected to healthy relationships and to good people live longer, they have better lives, they have better medical conditions, and they have fewer psychological and psychiatric problems. That mind-body research is showing us that the relationships that God designed us to be in are actually good for us in many, many ways. We are at our best when we are deeply connected in vulnerable and intimate ways. And we are at our worst when we're not connected. I was working with a professional woman who told me that in so many words. She said, "I like my career and I like myself when I'm connected to a few people that I care about. But when I'm alienated from them and we're not getting along, I don't like myself and I don't like my job." God has designed all of us for relationship with each other. It's a natural thing and it's a God-given thing. The second part in the sequence, though, is not so encouraging. There's damage. You know, as a race, we damage each other. We're not good to each other. It all started back in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve first fell away. But our relationships of vulnerability and intimacy sometimes work against us. And that's what I mean by the damage. You've probably identified with this, that there's been someone you trusted, opened up to, let them know who you really were, and somehow they didn't treat that very well. There was control, or there was judgment, or there was maybe just going away. And a little equation comes in our mind of maybe this isn't the way it ought to be. I want to particularly focus in this damage section on trust issues, because Beyond Boundaries is really about trust, learning how to trust again. And one of the first things that goes in a damaging relationship is trust. The ability to be careless, the ability to open up with someone, to feel like you can be all of yourself with someone. The business writer Patrick Lencioni, in his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, talks about two kinds of trust on a leadership team, and it applies to us whether in business or in relationships. He talks about, and I'll use the term functional trust, where you trust someone because they're dependable. I hope you'll get the report in on Thursday at 3 o'clock, and you do. I hope that you'll show up when you say you will, and you do. That's functional trust. But functional trust is not nearly as important as relational trust. Relational trust is when I know that you know all of me, and you still accept me, and you're still safe with me, and you're not going to use that information in any bad way, and you're not going to keep score. Relational trust always trumps functional trust. And that's what begins to erode and deteriorate when there are problems in the damage section. I'll give you an example of this in a couple I worked with. We'll call them Keith and Nancy. Nancy had a hard time with Keith when he would disconnect from her, especially in her times of needing support. Maybe the kids were going crazy or her job was tough, and he would sort of just check out. He'd watch videos, change the topic, get online, or kind of take a walk. He was really unable to deal with her needs. Nancy had trusted Keith when they got married because she loved him and he was basically a good guy. But her ability to trust him began to erode over time because when she would put out the need, that's when he was at his worst. Well, guess what happened to Nancy? Her ability not only to trust Keith, but other people began to deteriorate. She began to sort of check out herself. We call this in psychology emotional detachment. And Nancy began to detach emotionally because the equation in her mind was, this isn't working and it hurts too much. I think I'll just get busy. The damage remains. This takes us to our third event in the sequence, and that's a thing called boundaries. Now, if you've read any of Henry Cloud's and my books over the years, you know that we talk a lot about boundaries helping us in relationships, and boundaries are our friend. They really do help us. They help us especially when a relationship is difficult. You know, in Matthew 5, Jesus told us to let our yes be yes and our no be no. And that's really the core of boundaries, is having the freedom to say yes to some things and no to other things. And it's taught all the way through the Bible. A boundary is basically a property line. It sets out what belongs to you, like in your home or in your yard, and what's your responsibility and your problem sometimes, and what is not in your yard and what is not in your home that you're not responsible for. And a boundary is very, very valuable because it saves time, energy, and relationships. There are two kinds of boundaries, and this is really important for the material in the Beyond Boundaries video series. The first kind of boundary is called a defining boundary. A defining boundary tells you who you are and tells the world who you are. A defining boundary is about your values and your beliefs and your opinions and what you stand for. Defining boundaries should not really change a lot over life once you know who you are, because it has to do with the core and the essence of who you are. When a person doesn't have defining boundaries, they often feel lost or adrift, or like other people can tell them who to be. Here's a good example of a defining boundary. Very simple. I need to decline the meeting that you'd like me to go to tomorrow night. It's just not right for me. I just don't want to go. It's not a good time for me. When you have a defining boundary, there's no bad guy. Everybody's a good guy. It just doesn't work for me. It's my way to say no because I understand what's best for me. But a second kind of boundary is the one we're going to be talking about in Beyond Boundaries more, and those are your protective boundaries. Your protective boundaries. Protective boundaries have to do with what happens when we're in danger, when there's a controlling relationship, when there's a manipulative relationship. They protect us from harm. They help us to know when something bad's going to happen and how to prevent it. I'll give an example of a protective boundary. The next time you use abusive language with me, I'll be walking out of the house and getting in the car and staying with a friend. I will not tolerate that kind of language with me. You can say what you need to say all you want. I'm not going to change you. I'm not going to try to control you, but I will not be around abusive language. I have a zero tolerance. There's a big difference between a protective boundary and a defining boundary. While a defining boundary says, we're friends, I've just got choices and you've got choices, a protective boundary is erected and constructed to solve a problem. Now here's why this is so important for our Beyond Boundaries series. Never lose your defining boundaries. Never lose who you are. Never lose your values and your beliefs and your feelings and your opinions. God made you that way. As you develop emotionally and spiritually and relationally, you'll have very good defining boundaries. But sooner or later, you must lose a lot of those protective boundaries. Once you have said no to someone who has been manipulative or difficult or controlling, you can't keep that up all the time because you're going to move into isolation. The protective boundaries should exist as long as you need protection. But once you're safe, and once you've moved on, or once you've set some limits, it's time to do the healing and the growth and the recovery you need in all your relationships, because a life with nothing but protective boundaries is like a life with a moat around you. You don't want a moat because you're going to be isolated. So always keep the distinction between defining boundaries, which we should always have, and protective boundaries, which not only distance us from a troublesome relationship, but also distance us from the right kind of people. Which leads us to the fourth part of this whole sequence. And here's kind of where we get in trouble, actually. It's the return of desire. The return of desire. You see, you can only be disconnected and protected for so long, but God's system of making you a relational person with needs and desires begins to return. We are still relational beings. Even after you've had a tough relationship, a tough marriage, a tough business partnership, a tough friendship, a tough childhood, you are still a relational being. That never went away. It's a little like saying, well, because I had a bad steak, I'll never eat steak again. You really can't stay in that setting. I'll give an example of this. Let's talk about a friend of mine named Gary. I'll call him Gary. And Gary had a very, very difficult marriage. It didn't go well and it ended. And for a long time, Gary felt sort of burnt by relationships. And so he dove himself into his work, which a lot of people do, worked in his career, and for 2 or 3 years, he decided, I'm just not qualified for a relationship. I don't want it. It's been too painful. I'll run into work. You know what happened after about the 3rd year? He began to feel an emptiness inside. He began to feel a longing inside. He began to feel a desire inside. That's what I call the return of desire. And he could not stop that, nor can you stop that. And if you think, well, I'll just swear off relationships, whether they be romantic or family or business or whatever, I'll just swear off relationships. You really can't do that. No matter how much work you throw yourself into or how many great activities you throw yourself into, the reason you were constructed by God was for a relationship. The return of desire will happen. And it generally happens after the person has set some limits and gotten safe. Now we have a problem. In psychology, we call this a double bind, because we need relationship and at the same time we fear relationship. And this is a position we can't stay in forever. And the whole purpose of our video series is to help you get past that double bind into learning how to drop the guard and learning when it's safe to trust again and how to make the moves you need to make to open up to the right sorts of people. Let me end this session with a couple of skills, because there are things you can do and action steps you can take to make this helpful to you. First, admit to someone in your life, someone that you trust, that you might not want to move beyond boundaries because it's been safe for so long, but that you want to move beyond boundaries. You may say, I just like it safe here. I like my work, I like my church, I like my hobbies, but vulnerability has never been good to me. Just say to that person, I don't really want to. I just want to. I know it's best. And that will begin to get your neuronic patterns and habits working so that you get ready for this material. Secondly, do a little writing assignment. Write down 2 protective boundaries you have and 2 defining boundaries you have. 2 about protection and 2 about definition. The protection might be, I get suspicious of people. I don't give people the benefit of the doubt. I turn and walk away, or I check out when I think someone's going to be controlling, or when someone's going to be untrustworthy. Just write these down so that you kind of get a sense of your pattern. But also write down a couple of defining boundaries, like, I'm pretty clear about my opinions, about my beliefs, about my emotions. I can let my yes be yes and my no be no. This will help to clarify who you are. And then thirdly, the third skill is really a prayer, because I think that God's the one that resources and guides this. It's His system. And that's this: ask God to prepare your heart to move toward risk again. Ask God to prepare your heart to move toward vulnerability and intimacy again. He designed you for this. I hope the series will be helpful to you in this journey.